I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, haunted places, they were all just stories, meant to scare us but ultimately fictional. But what happened to me in that elevator made me question everything. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and I was working overtime in an old office building downtown. My floor was the only one with lights on, and even the janitor had already left. The building was one of those old, slightly run-down ones that creaked in the wind and had that musty smell of history. I had just finished sending off a few last-minute emails when I decided to head home. I gathered my things, turned off my computer, and walked down the empty hallway towards the elevator. The elevator itself was ancient, one of those old models with heavy, scratched-up doors and a faded interior. I had taken it hundreds of times before, but that night, as I pressed the button and waited for it to arrive, I felt a slight unease. I brushed it off as fatigue. The elevator arrived with a faint ding, and the doors slowly creaked open. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. The doors closed with a soft thud, and the elevator began its descent. It started normally enough, but about halfway down, the elevator suddenly shuddered and came to a jerky stop. The lights flickered, and for a split second, I was plunged into darkness. Then the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the small space in an eerie, dim glow. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, but nothing happened. I tried pressing the buttons for other floors, but still nothing. I was stuck. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Typical, I thought, trying not to panic. I decided to use the emergency phone in the elevator. I picked up the receiver, but there was only static. Great, I thought, just my luck. I put the phone back, took a deep breath, and tried to think logically. I could wait it out. Someone would eventually realize the elevator was stuck, and they'd come to fix it. Minutes ticked by, and the silence was suffocating. The only sound was my own breathing, and the occasional creak of the elevator. I tried to distract myself, thinking about what I'd do when I got home, but my mind kept returning to my current situation. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, and I started to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft scratching sound, coming from above. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get in. I looked up at the ceiling, where the maintenance hatch was, and my heart began to pound. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a bird or rat stuck in the walls. But the sound didn't stop. It continued, growing louder and more frantic. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there. I backed into the corner of the elevator, my eyes glued to the hatch. The scratching turned into a thumping, like something was hitting the metal from the other side. I was frozen, unable to move or think. Then, without warning, the hatch suddenly popped open, just slightly, and I could see darkness beyond it. My heart was in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The hatch slowly opened wider, and I could hear the sound of something, or someone, climbing down. I did the only thing I could think of, I pressed myself against the wall, as far away from the hatch as possible. I watched in horror as a hand emerged from the darkness above, gripping the edge of the hatch. It was pale, almost sickly looking, with dirt under the nails. Another hand followed, and then a face. It was a man, but there was something off about him. His eyes were wild, wide open and bloodshot, and his face was gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days. He moved with a strange, jerky motion, like his limbs didn't quite work right. He was muttering something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed with fear. The man climbed all the way down, dropping into the elevator with a thud. He stood there for a moment, staring at me with those wild eyes, and I could see his lips moving as he continued to mutter to himself. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I instinctively raised my arms to protect myself, and we struggled. He was stronger than he looked, and I could feel his fingers digging into my skin as he tried to grab me. I fought back with everything I had, kicking and scratching, desperate to get away. In the chaos, I managed to hit the emergency alarm button. The elevator filled with the sound of the shrill alarm, and the man suddenly stopped, as if the noise had startled him. He backed away, looking around the elevator in confusion. The alarm seemed to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. He looked at me one last time, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear, and then he scrambled back up through the hatch, disappearing into the darkness above. I stood there, shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare move until I heard the sound of the elevator repair crew arriving a few minutes later. They pried the doors open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that elevator as possible. I reported the incident to the building management and the police, but they didn't find anyone. They searched the building, checked the security cameras, but there was no trace of the man. No one could explain how he got in, or out, of that elevator. I never took that elevator again. In fact, I never went back to that building. I couldn't. The memory of that night still haunts me, and every time I hear the faint sound of scratching, I can't help but think of those wild, bloodshot eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I've never been a fan of elevators. There's something unsettling about being trapped in a metal box, suspended by cables, with no control over your surroundings. But in my line of work, I don't have much of a choice. As a building inspector, I spend a lot of time in elevators, checking on the structural integrity of old and new buildings alike. Most of the time, it's routine. But every now and then, something happens that makes me rethink my career. It was a rainy Friday evening when I was called to inspect an old apartment building in the city. The place had seen better days, faded paint, cracked walls, and a smell of mildew that seemed to seep from every corner. The residents had been complaining about the elevator malfunctioning, and the building owner wanted it checked out before the weekend. I arrived at the building around 8 p.m. The lobby was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights that gave the place a haunted house vibe. I made my way to the elevator, a creaky old thing that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The doors were scuffed and scratched, and the control panel was worn, with numbers barely visible. I pressed the button, and after a few seconds of rattling and clunking, the elevator arrived with a loud, metallic thud. The doors groaned open, revealing a dimly lit interior. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The doors closed behind me with a sound that reminded me of a prison cell shutting. I pressed the button for the top floor, intending to work my way down. The elevator jolted to life, and I felt the familiar sensation of rising. The numbers on the panel lit up one by one as I ascended, but around the fourth floor, the elevator suddenly jerked to a stop. The lights flickered, and I felt a drop in my stomach as the elevator seemed to lose power. I sighed, figuring it was just another glitch. I pressed the button for the lobby, but nothing happened. I tried the emergency button, but all I got was a dull click, followed by silence. My phone, predictably, had no signal. I was stuck. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I'd been trapped in elevators before, and it was never as bad as it seemed. I just had to wait it out until someone realized the elevator wasn't working. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to get uneasy. The air in the elevator felt thick and heavy, and the silence was oppressive. Suddenly, the elevator jerked again, and I felt it start to move, but not up or down. It was shaking, as if something was wrong with the cables. My heart began to race as I imagined the worst-case scenarios. The walls of the elevator felt like they were closing in, and I struggled to breathe. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The elevator was still again, but something felt off. I looked around, and that's when I noticed it, the number on the control panel. It was blank, with no indication of which floor I was on. I pressed the button for the lobby again, and this time, the elevator moved. But instead of the familiar feeling of descending or ascending, it felt like the elevator was floating. The sensation was disorienting, like being in a dream where gravity didn't apply. The walls seemed to shift and warp slightly, and I had to steady myself against the rail to keep from falling. The elevator stopped again, and the doors slowly creaked open. I expected to see a hallway or a floor, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was an unfinished, dark, and dusty corridor, with exposed beams and wires hanging from the ceiling. There were no lights, and the only illumination came from the dim glow of the elevator itself. The air was stale, and there was a faint smell of decay. I stepped out cautiously, trying to get my bearings. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, like a part of the building that had been abandoned during construction. But that didn't make sense. There were residents living just a few floors above and below. How could this place exist in a building that was supposedly fully occupied? I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. The silence was thick, almost tangible, like the building itself was holding its breath. I took a few steps down the corridor, my footsteps kicking up dust, and that's when I saw it, a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. Something told me not to go near it, but I was drawn to it, compelled by a mix of curiosity and dread. As I approached, I could feel a cold draft seeping through the gap. The door creaked open as I nudged it with my foot, revealing a small, empty room. There was nothing remarkable about the room at first glance, just 4 walls, a bare floor, and a small, dirty window. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something scratched into the wall near the floor. I crouched down to get a better look, and my heart skipped a beat when I realized what it was, a series of tally marks, like someone had been counting the days they'd been trapped in here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been here, stuck in this place, with no way out. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. I had to get out of here. I had to find help. I turned to leave the room, but as I reached the doorway, the door suddenly slammed shut with a force that made the walls shudder. I grabbed the handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic set in, and I started pounding on the door, yelling for help. But no one came. The only sound was the thud of my fists against the wood and the rapid beating of my heart. After what felt like hours, the door finally gave way, and I stumbled back into the corridor. The elevator doors were still open, the light inside flickering. I ran to it, not caring where it took me as long as it was away from that room. I slammed the button for the lobby, and the doors closed. The elevator jerked to life, and I felt it moving again, this time with a definite downward motion. I watched the numbers light up, counting down the floors, and when the doors finally opened, I was back in the lobby. I stumbled out of the elevator, breathing heavily, my heart still racing. The lobby was empty, the lights still flickering. I ran out of the building and didn't stop until I was safely in my car. I reported the incident to the building owner the next day, but when they went to check, there was no sign of the corridor or the room. The elevator was working fine, and none of the residents had reported anything unusual. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And every time I think about it, I can still see those tally marks on the wall, a silent reminder of someone who was trapped and forgotten in that place. I never went back to that building, and to this day, I can't step into an elevator without feeling a knot of fear in my stomach, wondering if it will take me somewhere I don't want to go.